All right. Everyone seeing it still?
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Yes, sir.
Okay, this is our 29th lesson, and we'll be continuing in the ice caps. As I pointed out in our earlier studies, I don't know of very many flood models that take into account a reasonable explanation of the ice caps that we see in Antarctica and Greenland. Now, I've flown over Greenland. I've never been to Greenland, but I've flown over it when I went to Russia and lectured there. But the Greenland ice caps are pretty thick, and Antarctica ice caps are very thick. Now, we asked the question, and we dealt with this to some extent last week in our last lesson about the thickness of the ice caps. Snow, depending upon how wet or dry the snow is, will be from anywhere from 10 to 12 inches of snow. It'll take that much snow to make 1 inch of water. Now, since your ice is basically just frozen water, I know it expands slightly when it freezes, but basically for practical purposes, an inch of water will make an inch of ice. So what we get is we're going to have, if it's real wet snow, we'll have to have about 10 inches of wet snow to make an inch of ice when it melts and freezes. And then we'll have to, if it's fairly dry snow, we'll have to have about 12 inches of it to make an inch of ice. So if you figure around maybe 11 inches or roughly 12 inches to make a foot of an inch, so you got 12 inches of snow, a foot of snow to make 1 inch of ice. The ice caps in some places are still close to 2.5 to 3 miles thick. Now, if you extrapolate that out, you're going to have something like 500 foot of snow every year to get in 400 or 500 years. Now, one of the flood models, and this is a Whitcomb and Morris Creation Research Society flood model, they claim that the Earth after the flood created the ice caps, that the ice caps were formed after the flood. And that's what they claim. But the problem with it is, and they claim it took about 500 years to do it. Now, the problem with it is, and Whitcomb and Morris have a lot of good material, excellent materials, but I believe they're just dead wrong on this one. And the thing about it is, if you put 3 miles of ice and you figure 5,280 feet per mile, and you do that in 500 years, you're going to have several hundred feet of snow falling every year. And that would be in Antarctica and Greenland. But the problem with that is that the snow doesn't generally fall very much in those places. Those places, when they get real cold, are very, very, very dry. So we have a problem there. Now then, you've got a fantastic amount of snow falling in order to get this ice in 500 years. And so I think they've got a problem with it. Now, my model explains the ice and explains the levels of sea level changes as well. Now, another claim made by the atheist is, and some old Earth creationists as well, I'm not an old Earth creationist, but did a reduction in solar energy produce the ice caps. That's one of the claims that's made. Burgess, and again, if you have my book, if you don't have it, text me, email me, and I'll send electronic copy of it for you. There's no evidence in the lunar samples of any change in the intensity or frequency of solar flares. The solar wind of galactic cosmic radiation as far back as they could look into the history of the moon. Now, this is from the moon now, the lunar samples. Now, the solar wind is a wind of particles, mostly, it would be mostly, probably protons mostly. There may be some helium nuclei, but mostly they're protons. There might be some helium, but these particles are coming at very high rates of speed, and it's called the solar wind. And there's no evidence, and these particles, when they hit something, can grind it up a bit. they'll affect it, and they'll pockmark it and break it into smaller pieces. Of course, they're very small themselves, so their changes are microscopic. That is, they're on the level of the molecule. But the solar wind has not changed for 4.5 billion years, they claim. Of course, I don't believe the universe is that old, but they're claiming that there's no evidence that it's changed ever. Thus, the lunar studies may indicate that the Earth's ice ages were not triggered by changes in the sun, as had been speculated. So the claim has been made that the ice was attributed to changes in the output of the sun, but the solar wind will be a measure of the output of the sun. The hotter the sun gets, the stronger the solar wind would be, and the cooler it gets, it would diminish these number of particles. The particles come out due to thermal agitation or thermal energy, and the hotter it gets, the more that are going to come out from the sun. So the fact that there's not been any changes in it from their evidence indicates that the ice ages were not triggered by changes in the sun. That's what Burgess claims. Some of these are very scholarly books, or considered to be scholarly at least. Now, Berner, again, all of these books are cited in my bibliography, so you can find them. Did the removal of atmospheric CO2 cause the ice caps? Well, we're hearing right now carbon dioxide is going to cause the Earth to heat up. Well, if we lose the carbon dioxide, would it cause it to cool off? And of course, that's one of the theories. Another theory of how the ice caps were created is related to the loss of carbon by the burial of sediments, right? The removal of atmospheric CO2, that would be carbon dioxide, by the massive burial of sedimentary organic matter during the Carboniferous and Permian periods, evidenced by the abundance of coal of this age, amplified the large mid-Paleozoic drop in CO2 concentration. That's Berner. So the ice caps were supposedly formed when we lost all that carbon dioxide and buried all of these materials in the Carboniferous and Permian periods. So that's one of the claims. And of course, I believe that the burial of the materials, so organic matter, was done during the flood itself, and the coal and so forth. But we dealt with that. Berner goes on, and consequently lowered greenhouse effect from that drop likely had a major influence in bringing about the Permio-Carboniferous glaciation. So the glaciers, they claim, occurred. Now, they claim there's several periods of glaciation, of glaciers forming. I don't believe that. And we'll explain their arguments for it, and I'll show how my model explains it without having several glacier periods, glacial epochs. The most extensive and longest glaciation of the entire Phanerozoic. These results further support the idea that the atmospheric greenhouse effect has been a major factor in affecting greenhouse global climate change over the geologic time. And of course, they're latching onto that with their climate change idea. And of course, I'm convinced again that they're wrong in this regard as well. But we'll be dealing with this even further. We'll get more and more evidence from this. It's not my intention to so much deal with the climate change so much, but it's part of my model, and we have to look at it. Questions so far, anybody? Berner continues, and the estimates of changes in the solar constant with time show that it essentially increased linearly over the past 570 million years by 4.6%. Now, he's claiming that the solar constant changed in a linear fashion. Well, in my experience with science and engineering, and I have not seen hardly anything that changes in a linear fashion. Physical things in nature tend to change with a logarithmic fashion. Now, James, you're a physicist as well. Have you ever seen very many things that change in a linear fashion?
No, I haven't. I've certainly seen exponential.
Yeah, I've never seen hardly anything that would change that way. Now, another problem with it, when you change something in a linear fashion, and not in an exponential fashion, it will generate harmonics. And due to what we call the Fourier analysis, and it would generate a series of harmonics. We'll get back to that in a later explanation of one of the arguments that they make for the age of the Earth. We'll use that to explain it. But linearity, something tries to be linear. Nature doesn't like linear stuff. It doesn't like it. It generates harmonics, generates all kinds of other stuff, garbage stuff. Not by garbage, I mean it generates what we see vibrations, or if it's mechanical, it'll generate mechanical vibrations, and other things will occur. Electronics, electrical systems will generate harmonic frequencies. But he gives no evidence for this increase in the energy output of the sun. He just hypothesized it, theorized it, because ice ages demand that this occur. But if we go back, we don't see that in the solar wind. So there's no evidence from the solar wind. The solar wind should have changed over that time. And again, we see this linear change, linearity, and I don't see that. Linear increase would not account for several ice ages. It would maybe account for one, but it wouldn't account for several. Okay. Now, one could argue that the linear increase generated harmonics, and those harmonics went back and forth, and something to that effect, but they've never made that claim. The problem with it is some of these geologists don't know anything hardly to speak of about mathematics, and they will postulate that the Earth's magnetic field is changing in a linear fashion, which would generate all kinds of wild harmonics and in the magnetic fields. And so they postulate it, but they haven't really understood Fourier analysis, Fourier, Fourier analysis. They haven't understood that, and so they have a problem with their whole model. Their model falls apart with that. In today's Kerr, and this is another source, in today's circulation, surface currents carry heat and salt into the far North Atlantic. This is surface currents of the ocean as part of a globe-girdling conveyor belt of currents. A key turning point is the conveyor is the sinking of the salty, hence dense waters of the North Atlantic. So salt water is heavier, more dense than fresh water, so it will tend to settle to the bottom. And that's the North Atlantic Ocean to form a cold, deep current that flows back to the south. Now, this is Kerr again. All right. Now, Kerr continues. Wallace Brocard of Lamont has proposed that changes in the saltiness of the North Atlantic by turning the sinking on and off can act as an ice age climate switch with a built-in clock, just as the thing to drive a long series of climate oscillations. So they're claiming they do oscillate. They're getting close to the Fourier analysis, but they're not seeing the implications of it here. What the problem with it is the saltiness. How are you going to turn that on and off, make it change back and forth? That saltiness, and I don't see their model of how it can explain it. I'd like to see more evidence for it. Here's their claim, the conveyor belt theory, and this, of course, is Australia, New Zealand, South America, North America, Africa, and Greenland up here. Of course, this will be the Soviet Union and Russia. And so there's Japan, there's Korea. So the flow of the waters goes up and flows around, and that's their conveyor belt, supposedly. And so what we have is we have the surface water going like this and the subsurface water going in opposite directions. That's what they're claiming. Now, the problem with that is that they would tend to flow in one direction to the Coriolis effect, and they would tend to flow in one direction. But what we have here is that's what they're claiming, and that the water flows in different directions. Now, the North Atlantic water generally flows in this direction, the clockwise direction, if you're looking down from the top. In the southern hemisphere, it flows in a counterclockwise direction, the other direction. So it would go like this, and this one right here would go like this, back this way, counterclockwise. That would be the Coriolis effect. Okay. That's your conveyor belt theory. But I haven't seen the evidence for it. Right? In the past few years, this theory has almost been unanimously rejected by the scientific community. So the scientific community, by and large, has rejected this theory. And so if you do some research on it, you'll find it's fallen into great disfavor. It's also called the thermal haline circulation. And there's another model showing it. There are deep currents going one way and your other currents going the other way. Okay? But they can measure these currents now. And with submarines and other things, they've been able to measure it. Now, I'm going to give you evidence that there's only one ice age. We're going to try to explain it more thoroughly, more precisely. So some German geologists, knowing their country very well, for example, Gates has held the opinion that the withdrawals separating two successive stages were very unimportant, and there's no proof of the existence of several glacial periods. And so what these German geologists claim that there's only one period, and that what happened was the ice did move back and forth, but it was separated, and not with time, but just maybe a year or so, just a short period of time. Is my theory. These monoglacialists, and the mono, of course, is one. So the idea that there's only one glacial period, believe the glacier had one maximum and was stationary with small oscillations in detail, and then began to retreat spasmodically, and the climate did not become similar to the present until after this retreat. I believe that's probably what happened in post-glacial times. This opinion can be refuted only by referring to the evidence of deep wells sunk in the region of Berlin. So they claim that we've got some evidence from deep wells of this. Now, of course, the problem with this is, my claim is that these glaciers actually were coincident with the flood itself. And so the evidence that they have there, I think that the flood occurring coincident or at the same time with it. We'll look at our model more carefully as we develop it more thoroughly. Right? A single catastrophic deep freeze of the Earth would not fit very well with our ideas of uniformitarianism now right here. So Perklin and Larsland, they reject the single idea because they hold to uniformitarianism. But I want you to notice here, we started off very early in our study to show that the atheist has rejected uniformitarianism, yet they fall back on it to prove their case. In other words, they try to have it both ways. And so there's a problem, and I underline this to let you know that these fellows, they reject it on one hand, but then they appeal to it on other hands. When we look back through the geologic record, indeed, we do find evidence of other periods of extensive glaciation preceding the last one. The evidence consists largely of deposits known as tillites, which are nothing more than consolidated glacial till. So that's their evidence. And so we need to look at that and how that could be explained by flood model. Okay? These unsorted deposits are considered of glacial origin only when they rest on striated. This is like rocks with scratches on them. And what would happen is a chunk of ice would have some boulders in it, and they would run across the rock underneath them and scratch it. Form grooves in it, and polished rock surfaces. They can polish it. And the boulders that contain, they contain show striations. So these are like scratches on them, which you would get scratches. It's also possible that the glaciers oscillated back and forth across the landmass if they were changes in isostasy. Now let's talk about isostasy. If you take a boat and put it in water, it'll sink a certain amount depending on its weight. If you have a rowboat, a fairly small boat, and you step into it, you'll notice, if you ever watch, that it'll sink deeper into the water. Why? Well, that's called what we call here isostasy. And so basically, this is two Greek words, isos, which is the same, and to stand, and stasis, to stand. So what we have is it's standing at a certain point. Now, if we have ice deposited upon the land masses, then those land masses would sink deeper. The land, the earth, and let's just take North America, for example. North America is floating in molten rock. And so the material made in of the North America is made out of is more or less dense than the rock it's floating in. Otherwise, it would sink into it. So it is less dense. So it floats. But if you put large amounts of ice on it, then it will sink into the magma. And as it sinks, then that's isostasy. There will be changes in isostasy. And so if you get in a rowboat and somebody is kind of not very wise, he steps to one side of the small rowboat, he could tilt the rowboat over and tilt to one direction. It'll tilt due to that added weight on that side. And what we find is that the North American continent, with the large mass of ice on it that was deposited during the flood, the north part of the continent sank into the magma. Now, as this ice melts, it has to rise up. The Hudson's Bay is now still rising, and as ice melts, it'll rise even more. And what happens then is that there will be a tilting of the continent itself, and it's just like that rowboat. And of course, when the ice goes off it, if someone jumped out of the rowboat, then the rowboat would move upward, or if they just stepped out of it. So again, it'll go up, and that's isostasy. That's a very important principle in geology, because there would be changes in isostasy. It's like in your boat, if you stepped into it onto one side, your tackle box, your fishing tackle box would slide. As it was tied down, it would slide toward the side that was tilted. And that's exactly what we could see here with the ice. It would slide in one direction, and as it melted and pieces of it broke off, they would slide back. So we'd see this sliding back and forth of this ice. And as water moved across the continent, due to tidal action, that water would tilt the earth, tilt the continents as well. Now the continents are setting upon like the tooth, like a root of a human's tooth. They're called cratons, and so there's like a tooth sticking down. And these cratons, the atheists claim, have never really changed. We'll come back to those at a later time, but that'll be important for the study. So you might want to study on those, but they claim that they have not changed since the very beginning of the Earth itself. Okay. Hollingsworth says, I can refer only briefly to the cause of such fluctuations. Now, let's go back and look at the fluctuations. It's possible that these fluctuations moving back and forth, as they move back and forth, there are fluctuations, say. That's what he's talking about. I can refer only briefly to the cause of such fluctuations. The consensus of evidence is increasingly in favor of a worldwide distribution. It seems, therefore, that knowledge of increasing complexity of the climatic record must go far to eliminate many of the various suggested terrestrial causes, such as variation in the amount of carbon dioxide or volcanic dust in the atmosphere. So, again, volcanic dust. So these are some of the theories about how this occurred. We know if a big volcano erupts, it may cause a year or two of cold weather to occur. And there have been some large volcanoes that have erupted in the historic time. In the 1870s somewhere, there was a big one erupted in Indonesia area, and it caused almost a year without a summer, and it was a lot of people died from it because they just couldn't have food to eat, couldn't get enough food to eat. There are doubts as to adequacy, Hollingsworth says, the various astronomical hypotheses of Kroll and Milankovitch, which invoke variation in the Earth's orbit. Now, this is another theory, that the Earth's orbit has changed, and that has caused it. And so he claims that these changes, they don't have the required magnitude. cosmic theories, such as those of Hughes and Littleton, are also unlikely to be able to account for such short-term variations. Now, these changes in the Earth's orbit would be on a period of many thousands of years. And so the Earth, they claim, would have done that. Now, the time period would be too long. So what we're seeing is short-term variations, according to the atheists, and I would agree they're short-term. And these theories, Kroll and Milankovitch, and some of the other ones, Littleton and Hoyle, both of them would require long-term changes, not short-term. Again, the one atheist is shooting other atheists down, okay? And that's okay with me. I'll listen to their arguments. Continental elevation, polar or continental wandering, that's another theory that the land mass have moved around. And major changes in distribution of land and sea would all appear to be long-term changes, be unlikely individually to produce fluctuation of the type indicated by the evidence. In other words, they would take millions and millions of years to occur. And the atheist even claims that we've had an ice age about 20, 30,000 years ago. We had a big ice age. So they just don't have the time factor doesn't give you the fluctuations we'd have. Hollingsworth replies to arguments of several theories on ice cap formation in this article. These are published articles in referee journals. And so the articles have come out of some pretty high-powered sources, very high universities, like places like MIT and places like that. So these fellows are not just old country boys like me. They are actually men that are published and they're highly respected. So they're shooting down the other arguments, and I'll just quote them and go on to my way. All right. Now, 3 ice cap phenomena that must be explained by any model. Okay. First, it must explain the presence of the caps in both the Arctic and Antarctic regions at the same time. Right? So a problem is, even if a person is using the flood to explain it, it has to explain the presence of caps in both the Arctic and Antarctic regions at the same time. Second, it must explain the fact that tropical plants and animals survive this supposedly long period of time called the Ice Age, or Ice Ages. Now, what happens is, if it gets real cold in the northern Great Plains of the United States, that cold air moves south, and we had a very frigid winter this winter in the United States, in the southern plains. It got very cold, and that cold air will move south. We call it a Siberian Express when it comes across the north, out of Siberia, crosses the North Pole, and doesn't warm up doing that, crosses down through Canada. We jokingly said when I was a boy that where I grew up in western Oklahoma, that there were 2 trees between western Oklahoma and the North Pole, and one of them was 6 foot tall and the other was 5 foot tall. That's joking. So, but the problem is that large amounts of ice there, that cold air would come off that ice. And another problem with it, ice reflects light. We'll come back to that later, called albedo. It reflects light. And so it tends to make it colder, okay? Third thing that must be reconciled or explained is it must explain the non-periodic nature of the ice ages, dated by uniformitarian assumption. By periodic, we mean repeating at certain cycles of years. Now, if it was following the tilt of the Earth on its axis, or the Milankovitch cycles, it would be periodic. It would follow a rhythm. Might think of it as a rhythm. And so we don't see that even in any of the models that they claim, even with their atheistic dating, the long age dating, they don't have it periodic. So that won't fit many of the things that we see here. Questions so far? Anybody? All right. The dating of the ice caps. Now, how do they date them? The ice caps are dated by the atheist. The depth of the ice is measured. And then the present rate of snowfall is determined. And this is extrapolated or projected backwards, and the time that it took to deposit the ice caps calculated. Well, if you are thinking very carefully, you'll say, well, that's uniformitarianism. They're making assumptions of uniformitarianism. So their dating system is based on a system that they've already rejected, uniformitarianism. And they've not allowed for any catastrophes to occur. But catastrophism is now accepted by the geologic community. But if they want to get their ice caps in, they revert back to uniformitarianism, which they've already rejected. Again, this shows either an irrational nature or dishonest nature, one of the two, because they're harking back to something that they've rejected, uniformitarianism. Okay. Now, second, the radiometric dating, radiocarbon particularly, is used. Now, we'll study radiocarbon at a later time, and so we'll try to do that. My physics that I've studied, graduate work I've done, has been in small particle physics, not so much in nuclear and atomic. I've had a couple of classes in that, but I've got enough about radiocarbon dating to know that radiocarbon dating is not, it can't go beyond about 50, 60, 70,000 years. It just loses, it has no credibility beyond that time. It's used to date such things as the trees under the ice caps, but we'll talk about all of that in a later study. And so this material will continue on. It's in the book as well. Now, third, both dust particles and chemicals, usually acid, are found in the ice and linked to volcanic eruptions or other events and dated by these events. The only problem with these dating by these volcanic events is how they dated the volcanic events. Okay, see, that's a problem. So you get into circular reasoning, you date the volcanic events by one thing, and then you use the volcanic event to date something else. And of course, it all depends upon the dating of the volcanic events originally. So it goes back to circular reasoning. Right? These events are frequently dated by either uniformitarian geologic assumptions or radiometric methods. Radiometric would be by radiocarbon or other things. So we would have other radiometric dating techniques. This and earlier ice cores, so we have to deal with radiometric dating. I have badly shaken the long-held belief that interglacialists and ice ages were relatively stable events measured in thousands and tens of thousands of years. Respectively, Hughes says, this comforting concept was reinforced by ocean sediment cores, which have a maximum resolution of perhaps 1,000 years. The latest Greenland ice cores, by contrast, have resolution of decades or less. The problem we get into here is they're making some assumptions. Now, the resolution is perhaps 1,000 years. Now, these are ocean sediment cores. So what they're saying is when they see two layers of ocean sediment, they don't know whether they have 1 year or they have 1,000 years. But you see, the resolution is down to 1,000. We need to understand about measuring principles. Remember early when I took my first physics when I was a young buck, I took the first physics course, we talked about resolution of measurements, accuracy and precision. These are all different things. Now we need to separate them and get them distinct from one another. But here, the resolution, it's a bit like trying to measure the wear on a crankshaft on an automobile, if you know anything about that, with a yardstick. Your resolution on the yardstick is just not accurate enough to figure out how much wear and tear you have on. You probably need a micrometer to do that, or something like a micrometer to measure it. And if you know what I'm talking about, you'll understand the difference in the resolution. The resolution of 1,000 years just doesn't help us very much. The latest Greenland ice core, by contrast, has a resolution of decades or less. So decades. Now, when you see one, you don't know whether it's 1 year or 10 years. So if you got 1,000 ice layers, then you don't know whether that's 1 year or it's 100 years or 10,000 years, because your resolution is in decades, base of 10. Again, it's not very accurate from that standpoint. And the assumption is made that there's only one layer of ice in the layers of ice laid each year. Now, but my flood model would give you a bunch laid during the flood period. It would destroy the whole position if my flood view was proven to be true. Questions or comments again? Now, here's another source. We'll continue with this. Furthermore, the deposit feeding strategies of deep sea benthos mean that sediment fabrics are severely disturbed in deep sea settings. Now, benthos is an organism that bores into the bottom of the ocean or of a lake or a body of water of some sort. There are things that burrow into the bottom of the ocean and eat the materials or these things, the organic material that is in that sediment, and they live on it. And so they burrow into it. That's what he's talking about with deep sea benthos, mean that sediment fabrics are severely disturbed. So as they burrow around, they churn it up and burrow around in it. The notion that localized burrows displace form a microfauna to deeper levels is therefore an oversimplification of the problem. Yes. What they're saying is that these deep sea benthos organisms would just mess everything up. They would change the layers considerably as they churned it up to get the organic matter out of it. And so you can't tell. Maybe these organisms cause these layers to occur or to appear to occur. You're not certain. Again, we have a lack of certainty on it. In short, bioturbation, now bio is organisms. Bios is the Greek word for life. Turbation is to move it around. Spells trouble for dating rapid environmental shifts in deep sea sediment records. And as such, even the best dated records cannot resolve events with a time span of greater than 300 or 300 to 500 years. So your problem is you got resolution again. You don't have good resolution. It's like measuring the wear and tear on a crankshaft with a yardstick. You just can't do it with any degree of accuracy or precision, I should say. Now, what does it mean to resolve? We go back to our word resolve here, and we have our English word resolve. Merriam-Webster says to distinguish between or make independently visible adjacent parts of it. Now, that's pretty explanatory. So you just can't tell whether you got 1 year or 300 years. You can't tell the difference, and maybe up to even to 500 years. So if you got resolution, say, of 300 years, you got 3,000 layers. You don't know whether it's divided by 300, 3,000, that'd be 10 years. Say, or, we could multiply it by 300. And so again, we got problems. Again, bad resolution, measuring the wear and tear on the crankshaft with a yardstick. Not a good idea. Hughes, page 17, is saying that the one looking at ice caps cannot tell whether he has 1 ring or 10 rings, resolution of decades or less. And the one looking at sediment cores cannot tell whether he has 1 layer or 1,000 layers, 1 year or 1,000 years. If he dates something at 10,000 years, it may be only 10 years by his dating system. And so it's not very accurate, not very precise, I should say. How can they claim to have dated anything by this system with this kind of resolution? That's just almost a joke. And again, they'll go back to other sources to date it, which when they use the other sources to date it, that means their layers didn't mean anything. They're dependent upon that other source to date it. And the main source they always retreat to is radioactive dating, radiometric it's called. Now, how the ice caps are really dated. Let's look at that, and then we'll close for tonight. We'll go about another 5 minutes to close. Extensive glaciation like that of Pleistocene time has occurred at widely separated intervals during the long history of the Earth. Again, they're using the idea that the Earth is not changed over periods of time, uniformitarianism. The record of these ancient refrigerations consists of masses of tellite. We go back to that consolidated till. This is broken up rocks like gravel, like we'd use. We call it chat and gravel, in the midst of the sedimentary or metamorphic rocks. Tellite, sedimentary rocks were laid by sediment. Metamorphic, there's some heat involved in them. They metamorphized, they changed due to heat. The rocks did. Tellite is distinguished from other conglomerates. That's a mixture of several different kinds of rocks by its matrix of clay or silt and its glacially striated cobblestones and boulders. Striated, now they've got scratches on them, we'd say today. That's how we describe it. Right. Now, some places it rests on a glaciated rock floor or pavement. Sometimes it is associated with fine-grained sedimentary rocks, having varve-like laminations. Now, varve is layers of sediment in a lake. That's what that is. The age of the tellite is indicated by its relations to other rocks whose age have been determined either by their fossils, by the radioactive timekeepers, or by correlation with still other rocks whose age is known. Now, watch this. When it's all said and done, they determine the rock by the fossils. All right, what does that mean? Index fossils. And so they date the rock by the fossils and then date by the age of the fossils. And then they date the age of the fossils by the rocks they're in, the circular definition. And of course, then we get to radioactive timekeepers. They try to retreat to that, and we'll have to deal with that. So we will deal with that later. Or by correlation with still other rocks whose age is known. So we correlated with other rocks that we know their age. How do we know their age? By the fossils that's in them, or by radioactive timekeepers. Now, when it's all said and done, it's all circular. They're dating. And there's no absolute system of dating. We'll show, when we get to the radioactive, we'll show that it has some serious flaws in the reasoning. The flaws are simple. Now, I'll give them to you right now. But if you had in high school mathematics algebra, you can see it. What it boils down to, their equation has 4 variables in it, and they only know 2 of them for certain. And a third one is assumed to be certain value. So they have to make an assumption about one of the variables. So we'll look at that as we get to it later, but we'll show it, and I'll show the mathematics of it. You don't have to know anything in high school algebra. Will do the job, algebra 1, algebra 2. I'm going to call a halt to it right here at this point. Do you have any questions before we close it down? Okay. All right.